All right. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson, and we have another great one for you today. I have Dr. Gary Habermas and Dr. Mike Licona, and we're going to be refuting some arguments against the resurrection today. All right. So this is what I want to do. Man. I sent you guys a video. All right, we're going to go through this video, and if you guys don't mind, after the video is over, we're going to take some questions for the audience, and we're going to jump into this real quick, all right?
Perfect call for Paul. So here you go, Paul. Welcome, Jacob.
Hey, Jacob.
Hi there, Matt. Thank you for taking my call. It's good to speak to you too. So if you don't mind, the reason why is because I've been told, I'm not going to beat about the bush. I've been told that Jesus' 10 out of the 12 disciples died when they'd seen Jesus rise from the dead. Now I'm thinking if someone's willing to die for something that they've seen, then it should give us a clear proof of the story, because Nero mentions Peter dying for what he saw, and I think Nero mentioned Paul as well.
So Jacob, so I recently had a conversation on Unbelievable with Sean McDowell, who did his entire doctrinal dissertation on this. Do you know who Sean McDowell is, or his father Josh McDowell?
No, but
okay, so Josh McDowell, he wrote Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and he's very, very well known. And his son, Sean, did his doctrinal dissertation, probably the biggest doctrinal dissertation on the fate of the martyrs, fate of the apostles that exists. Now, in Sean's own words, only 2 of the 12, you had this exactly flipped. There is good evidence for only 2 of the 12, Peter and James, son of Zebedee. Those are the only 2 that we can have any level of confidence that what we know in history isn't just legend. In Sean's own words, he doesn't know where legend ends and where truth begins for 10 of the 12 apostles. So
now, is that true? I don't know, Dr. Michael Licona, if you want to speak to that a little bit. Is that true with Apologia saying that there's really only 2 disciples that we can, historically verify that was actually, were martyrs or died for the faith? Is that absolutely true when it concerns this subject matter?
I suppose it depends what you mean by verify, because, in historical investigation, we talk in terms of degrees of probability. For Peter, it's pretty certain. We've got a lot of evidence that Peter was martyred for his faith. You have it for Paul. You've got it for James, the brother of Jesus. For me, those are the 3 biggies right there. The rest of them, we do have some evidence. Some of it is late. And so when we talk about, we can be certain of some, I think for Paul, Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus. I think Sean has a couple of more than that. I was the external reader for his doctoral dissertation. He did an excellent job. We have some evidence for some of the others. It's just not as good as it is. So for me, as a historian, I would say for Paul, Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus, we can be certain that they died as martyrs. The rest of them, I think what's important is to say that we've got enough evidence to be sure that they were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs. And that's important, because you don't die necessarily for something you believe is false. Well, you might have one or maybe 2, but not all of them are going to be willing to suffer continuously and die for something they know is false.
Gary, do you have any input there or any thoughts at this portion?
Yeah, the first time I heard this, I really object to the comment of, quote, any degree of confidence. To me, that means the rest are improbable. In other words, no level of probability that Mike just alluded to. And I think the question from the beginning was skewed, because now, in all fairness, the caller asked about the 12 disciples, but then he said Peter and Paul. Apologia, I think he should have put the best foot out here and realized that the fellow was asking him about the apostles. There, besides the 12 disciples, Paul and James are both called apostles. The best evidence, as Mike just indicated, is for Peter, for Paul, for James, the brother of Jesus, and for, now here's Sean McDowell that they're talking about. And Apologia does not bring up Paul and James till it's pushed. Now he says James is Zebedee, and Sean does say that, but there's another one. So you've got Peter, James the son of Zebedee, but then the caller asks about Paul, and he's trying to answer the question for the 12. If he were a little bit fairer with the question, he would say that according to Sean, you have good evidence for the 2 James, Paul, Peter, and then Sean says probable evidence to different levels for Thomas and Andrew. Now that list is getting a little bit longer than to say, oh, 2 and 2 only, ask Sean, 2 and 2 only. We'll turn to chapter 19, Paul's conclusion, and Apologia goes on and says, hey, and everybody all apologists want to back off and say, willing to die. Yeah, well, but Sean was straightforward. Well, he should have read 2 more lines, because Sean McDowell says, again, Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, James, the brother of Jesus, Paul, he says excellent evidence. Then he says Thomas and Andrew, and then just a couple lines below that he says, and the strong evidence here is for the willingness of all of them. Now, Logia jumps on that, and he says, oh, yeah, what's willing to die? How do we know? Well, you know what? When people say, how do you read a man's mind? How do you know he's willing to die? I don't judge by what I think is in the man's mind. I judge by his feet. And when you go into a city several times and you've been beaten up, stoned, left for dead, beaten several times over, Paul gives a list of how many times he got 40 lashes minus 1. When that happens, guess what? You go back in the city, you're willing to die. He compares this to a criminal a little bit later. He said, criminals are willing to die, but they take it on the chin to make another robbery or something, is what he's implying. These guys had been beaten up. And of course, as Mike's already pointed out, the big 4 Christians, 3 of the 4, Sean says we have excellent evidence. I think it was really playing fast and loose with that fact. If you're going to cite Sean.
Jacob in the UK is calling in specifically to prove the resurrection. And
sorry about that, Doctor. What was the last thing you said?
No, that's okay. I was just saying I think there's a little playing fast and loose here with Sean. If you want to say how many of the 12, you cut your answer down. But nobody's going to put down, not even Bart Ehrman is going to put down James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, the apostle, or the apostle James, the brother of Jesus. And we have great first century data for the martyrdoms of both James, Paul, and Peter. But if you're going to say, oh, no, 2, ask Sean yourself, 2. Well, then you ask Sean. You do his reading and you go down a couple lines and he's going to say the big thing here is willingness. So I just think we're off on the wrong foot here because there's a total misconstrual of what Sean McDowell is saying.
All right. Let's continue on and let's see what else Apologia has to say.
Very, very well known. And his son Sean did his doctoral dissertation, probably the biggest doctoral dissertation on the fate of the martyrs, fate of the apostles that exists. Now, in Sean's own words, only 2 of the 12, you had this exactly flipped. There is good evidence for only 2 of the 12, Peter and James, son of Zebedee. Those are the only 2 that we can have any level of confidence that what we know in history isn't just legend. In Sean's own words, he doesn't know where legend ends and where truth begins for 10 of the 12 apostles. So you have that exactly flipped. Only 2 do we have good.
Okay,
I see you shaking your head, Doctor. What you got, Doctor?
Because he acts like he's quoting Sean. And the phrase he gives in, even Sean says these are the only 2 we can have any level of confidence. Those are not Sean's words. And when Sean goes on to say there's a half dozen, and he says only 2, and then Sean says the big thing is willingness, and he goes on to make fun of willingness, but he wants to cite Sean as if Sean's on his side. This isn't what you do to scholarship if you want to come across. If the listeners don't know he's misquoting him, so be it. But people who know, he shouldn't get away with this.
Yeah, sure, for sure. You got anything, Dr. Licona?
Not from what he said so far.
Okay.
Didn't know that. Sorry.
All right. Okay, no problem.
About that, I didn't know that. It's but if that's the case, if that's what the scholars are saying, why isn't that not being preached? Why did the vicars not say, oh, well, actually, we've made a mistake. You know what? We've made a mistake. It's actually 2, not 10.
Right, and Sean goes around saying this exact thing every time he's on every show ever. He admonishes pastors and other church leaders for using what is very poor evidence for the martyrdoms in order to try and make this point. I mean, and the other problem is, of course, I have my own criteria for martyrdom, which Sean and I have debated, but in my own criteria, it demands 3 things. First is that the person tells us that they saw Jesus after he died, a resurrected Jesus. 2 is that the person actually had a chance to recant, because if they didn't have a chance to recant, then really we're not saying that they died for truth at that point. They may well have died for pissing someone off, which actually in the case of Jesus's brother, that's exactly why he was killed, not for his beliefs.
What do you guys say to that? That his brother was killed because he got somebody angry and not for his beliefs. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Well, that's false. Josephus says in his Antiquities, Book 20, Section 200, that Albinus came in, or he was the high priest, I believe, at the time. I think it was Albinus, or maybe Albinus was the Roman prefect who was coming in, or I think they were called procurators by that point. Anyway, when the switch of the Roman governor was being made, Josephus reports that the high priest took this opportunity to arrest James, the brother of Jesus, and some others, and they charged them on the account of being lawbreakers, that is, breakers of the Jewish law, which is something that, according to the book of Acts, the Christians were charged as being breakers of the law, like Paul, because they were saying you were justified by faith. So that's entirely consistent. But that is not the only thing. That's just Josephus's story. Fuller accounts are found in Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria, and they discuss how they took James to the top of the temple, and they told him to deny that his brother is the Messiah, and when he refused, they threw him off the top. Now, I was on the Temple Mount a little over a year ago, and that's pretty high up, without even going to the top of the temple, just where the Temple Mount was, and we looked over where they would have thrown him, and it would be a nasty fall. I don't know, 75 to 100 feet, something like that. It'd be hard to survive that. Some would. And according to Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria, he did survive it barely. And then they took a fuller's club, hit him across the head, and then they stoned him. And again, that's because he wouldn't deny that his brother is the Messiah. So according to those two, he died as a martyr. So just because Josephus doesn't mention the whole story doesn't mean that we should think that, we have no accounts of it.
All right. Dr. Gary, you have anything?
Well, that was 62 AD, according to Josephus's details there in the book. And again, Paul Ogia is given part of the story. He says, because he ticked people off. Well, hey, that's shorthand in this case for, we're going to kill you. You believe the wrong thing. They made him a martyr. To whisk it away is because he ticked people. He ticked people because he was teaching somebody was the Messiah, as affirmed in Mark 14, 61 to 64. Jesus reportedly told the high priest that he was, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? It's a question. And he says, ego me, I am. And henceforth you'll see the Son of Man. And he uses the phrase coming in the clouds, which is a statement of that's only used of God. And then sitting on the right hand of God, which is reported in a couple of Jewish books, First Enoch and Fourth Ezra. And that's his brother. And then we read that James became a believer because he saw the risen Jesus. Now, I'm sure they would say, oh, well, that's not in 1 Corinthians 15, which, by the way, they call a story. It's only the most respected passage of Scripture by the atheist New Testament scholars. And we also have a narrated portion, very brief, of the appearance of Jesus to James in an early book, just a few years after the New Testament was completed, called the Gospel to the Hebrews. So this comes on good data that James claimed to see Jesus, believed in Jesus, was stoned for it. Final stage of this, as Mike just explained. See, these are partial stories, wanting people to say, oh, yeah, you guys are reporting all the wrong things. And again, we've got to give the whole report.
Yeah, it's cancel culture 2.0.
Definitely. All right, let's see.
What bothers me, Marlon, what bothers me as this discussion goes on, they keep asking the guy, do you agree? Do you agree? Do you agree? And they want to hear some kind of agreement from this person. It's a little bit of mild bullying, a little bit of pushing. The fella doesn't seem to be super familiar with the data, but they're not presenting it well. And so they get a partial response from somebody who, and by the way, when he responded right there, he said Paul, and Logia is still talking about Peter. And he wants to stay on the subject of the two. He doesn't want to address the others. And also, by the way, he said that the best cases we have are for Peter and Paul. Thank you. You put James, the brother of Jesus, in there, as Mike mentioned, and now you got the three of the most influential Christians of all time. This case is looking better all the time. Don't forget the other two, three actually. Sean is going to throw in James, the son of Zebedee, Thomas, and Andrew as probable cases. Now we're up to a half dozen.
I mean, so what is the? I get getting some feedback there. All right, so I'm hearing some feedback coming through. So it seems. What is the importance of this idea of martyrdom? How does that prove the resurrection or show evidence, a high probability that the resurrection is true? I don't think we want to really explain that aspect for those who are maybe in my audience that really don't understand that understanding.
I think, it goes to the sincerity of their beliefs. It's like Muslims, jihadists today who blow themselves up in suicide bombings. Certainly when they're approached about this and they say, hey, we want you to give your life for the cause of Islam, strap this bomb to your back, or sit in this car and push the button and blow yourself up and take a lot of people with you. The person they're talking to doesn't step back and think for a moment and think, well, let's see, Muhammad was a false prophet. The Quran is not the word of God. And if I kill all these innocent people, I'm probably going to go to hell. Let me sign up. Where do I sign? They're not thinking that. They're thinking that Islam is true and they want to do it in the cause. They really believe in the cause. The fact that the disciples were all willing to suffer continuously and at least willing to go to their deaths for their gospel proclamation, which included the death and resurrection of Jesus, shows that they sincerely believed what they were proclaiming is true.
All right. Let's see what Paul, what else he has to say.
And the third one is that we actually know they died. So on the third one, we only have 2 out of the 12. We also have Paul and the brother of James, but they're not part of the 12, so we're not talking about them.
To be fair, we're
I thought you guys were saying something. Okay.
convinced that all of them have in fact died. It's
We're
just
convinced
not
that they
all
died.
of them
Right.
died as martyrs.
Died as martyrs, or died in any way, that we could say that they died for their faith. So, and then the other problem, so of course the problems there is that we don't know, we also don't have these people saying in their own words that I saw Jesus appear. We literally, even if we took 1st and 2nd Peter as written by the Apostle Peter, which I do not believe, but even if we did, nowhere in those 2 books does Peter say, I saw a resurrected Jesus. That's just not in there. And then for the other...
Can you hold on that second? Take a pause there.
Yeah, you got it.
We've got, I believe it's 9 accounts that speak or imply that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. In none of those accounts, those ancient accounts, does anyone come out and say they saw Caesar cross the Rubicon. Caesar, in his commentary on the Civil War, doesn't even mention crossing the Rubicon. So Caesar himself doesn't mention it. Okay, so the fact that you don't have these eyewitnesses writing something and directly testifying that they saw the risen Jesus. I mean, you got Paul, he does, but the fact that you don't have some of these saying directly, I saw the risen Jesus. I mean, we'd like to have it, but that's not at all a deal breaker, not in the least.
Any thoughts on that, Dr. Gary?
Well, hey, we can save this for when he talks about the appearances. But one thing I'll mention right now, these two gentlemen here may think the Jesus Seminar are, pretty skeptical. They're the ones that, according to the red and pink letter markation, reject up to 90% of the New Testament, so-called red letter words of Jesus. And yet when they get to volume 2 on the Acts of Jesus, the very skeptical group known as the Jesus Seminar, Paul's statement. Now, Paul Logia is going to say here in a minute, Paul never says he saw the risen Jesus. False. False more than once. He says, last of all, he appeared to me. And he already said, 1 Corinthians 9:1, he uses a normal word for sight and says, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus? Only sheer ignoring those passages can get to that conclusion. But back to the Jesus Seminar. There's the statement by Paul, I saw the risen Jesus. They judge it to be red. Red. Okay, now Mike said a moment ago, we don't have a description of Caesar's horse getting wet as he went across the river, but everybody believes he crossed the Rubicon, right? Okay, well, how about Peter? Peter's at the beginning of that list in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following. And it says, he appeared to Peter. You know what the Jesus Seminar colors that? Pink. Pink means probably. And they explain in a footnote, here's why we say probably. Peter doesn't say it. Paul cites the creed, but we still think it's accurate. So now on the Jesus Seminar, you have a red for Paul, a pink for Peter, and then they add, we think the women saw him too. All right, well, hey, we've got a mounting here of some evidence, and that's the early Christian creed. The women aren't there, but the early creed in 1 Corinthians 15 and following. And the Jesus Seminar rate 2 of the appearances red and pink, respectively. But they're just going to go, no, there's nothing here. Nobody says this. And when Paul Logia explains this, he's gonna get it wrong. We're going to hear it here in just a second.
All right.
For one, James, son of Zebedee, similarly in the book of James, it doesn't say, I saw Jesus. So, this argument that people try and put forth of, we solidly have these apostles who were eyewitnesses, and this is why they died. That argument just falls apart historically so quickly. It's terrible. So this is actually why modern apologists have shifted it back to say the apostles were willing to die. If you listen to any of the big ones, they all shifted back. They were willing to die. So obviously they were wandering around knowing they could have been hurt. But that's not a very good example. There's a lot of criminals who wander around and they know that there's a chance they're going to get caught. But that doesn't mean they don't go around stealing things or murdering people. Everyone knows there's a chance there's going to be consequences, but we still take that risk. So,
Dr. Mike Licona, I see that face, man. What you got, man?
Well, first, he said the letter of James was written by James, the son of Zebedee. I don't know any scholars who say that. It's attributed to James, the brother of Jesus. Now, they can question whether James actually wrote it. A lot of scholars say they don't think he did. A number of them think he did. I think he did. But it's James, brother of Jesus, not James, the son of Zebedee. Then he's doing it, saying murderers, they do what they're doing and know they could get caught. The difference is that the disciples are going around proclaiming Jesus, his resurrection, and Jesus' teachings. Teachings like, let your yes be yes and your no be no. In other words, don't lie. Don't be true to your word. Treat people the way you want for them to treat you. For this is the law of the prophets. Both of those in the Sermon on the Mount. They're proclaiming that you should be honest and do right to people. And so why are you going to go out and base this on something you know to be a lie? And murderers are doing this in secret so that they won't get caught. The disciples are out there proclaiming publicly about these things. There's a big difference between murderers and Jesus' disciples.
even that apologetic that's saying, well, the disciples know.
All right, all right. Gary, do you have anything to add on to that?
I think Mike's hit some good points here. We've talked about the problems with the sort of half citation of Sean McDowell, but to me, maybe the worst thing here, well, in a minute he's going to say Paul doesn't tell us he saw Jesus. That's an absolute zero wrong comment. But I think a really bad one is when he said, and this just heard a moment ago, he says, I know there's people in many religions who die for their faith. Okay, great, wonderful. Hey, by the way, he just contradicted himself in a sense, because when you see somebody in another religion die for their faith, we as Christians allow that they really believed in that faith. But he compares them to criminals, because I guess that would apply to them too. They're criminals. They're criminals. They're trying to pull one over. Mike made a great point. They do it in the dark. Criminals do it in the dark. Religious enthusiasts often do it out in the light. But the one that really bothered me is when he says people die in other religions. Here's the difference. Christians today die as martyrs. Muslims today die as martyrs. Usually when missionaries or others die as martyrs, we concede that they really believed it. We concede that they think of the truth of this. But the earliest disciples are the only ones who are willing to die for their faith. Of the big four, three of them, we have first century attestation of their death. And here's the difference. They claimed to see the risen Jesus. They were the only ones. Other people died for their testimony. They died for their own testimony because they said, I saw him. And then they keep going into the same city over and over and over. And as Mike said, not at night sneaking around. They went in the day and preached to anybody who would listen, got beat up, left for stoned in Lystra, and they keep preaching. The difference is the ones who saw Jesus were willing to die. You got the James reference in the Creed, 1 Corinthians 15. You got the James reference in the Gospel of the Hebrews. You got Paul claiming it at least twice, 1 Corinthians 9, 1 Corinthians 15. By the way, Bart Ehrman, Garrett Ludeman, they don't even start to doubt this stuff. And these guys are acting like all the New Testament guys are on our side. I don't know what New Testament guys are talking about, but as Mike's already said, they're way off the beaten path.
All right. Let's continue to see how off the beaten path they are.
They might have been hurt for this. It's pretty weak. You have to admit that that's no longer this compelling, grisly detail.
Well, I mean, I suppose, but I mean, if because that's a very good point about Peter and James, and you're right. That's absolutely true. But if Peter was willing, the problem is, if we've got historical evidence that Peter and James were willing to die, and the Apostle Paul died claiming that he was still Jesus, well, I wonder what convinced Peter and Paul in able to die for it. I wonder what convinced them, because there was many Christs in the time. So
the problem is you don't know. The problem, Jacob, is you don't know that they died or why. So you do realize that people have died for other religions as well, right?
Yeah, but this is just something that, that's true. That's true. And I'm
correct. It's much better to just say yes than yes, but, because there people have died for a lot of things. Now, I'm happy to accept that these individuals were not dying for something that they knew to be a lie, although I won't rule that out as a possibility, because there have been people who've been willing to sacrifice themselves for a greater cause, even if the thing that they're expressly stating they know to not be true. I've watched people nearly put themselves in this position. Sorry, what?
So this idea that people die for stuff that they believe in, the things that they believe in. So what would be the difference then? What would be the difference if they say that, well, the disciples just died for something they really believed in? And you got this Arab guy over here who really died for what they believe in. What makes the difference there, Dr. Licona?
Well, it's like Gary said just a moment ago. Others, like, let's just say Christians today, Muslims today, even Muslims from the very beginning, they are willing to die. They're willing to suffer and die for something they believe is true because they believe the testimony of others. Christians believe the testimony of what we find in the New Testament. Early Christians, before the New Testament literature was written, were believing the oral proclamation, the public proclamation they heard of the apostles. Muslims today are believing the Quran. Muslims who were followers of Muhammad were believing the testimony of Muhammad. Okay, but as Gary said, the difference is this: the disciples, the apostles, they believed based on what they perceived were appearances of the risen Jesus to them. They weren't basing it on the testimony of anyone else. They were basing it because they sincerely believed they had seen the risen Jesus.
So it's all about the eyewitness accounts, the eyewitness testimony that they died for, and not necessarily something that was told by secondhand sources. Gary,
Right.
Dr. Gary, you have anything else to add on that?
No, I mean, when they're going to go on here in just a minute, they're going to take a shot at Paul and totally mess it up. They're going to get the sources wrong. But I just want to say one more time. Paul affirms that he saw the risen Jesus, uses the normal word for sight in 1 Corinthians 9:1, says he saw Jesus. Paul Ogia is going to say in a second, Paul never saw Jesus. He says he never said he saw Jesus. Number two, James, we have the early creed, 1 Corinthians 15. That doesn't say why, but he is in the earliest creed. And we have the Gospel of Hebrews. And if someone says, oh, well, you like the Gospel of Hebrews when it's not in the New Testament, well, go tell Dom Crossan that. Go tell John Dominic Crossan that the Gospel of Hebrews is worthless. Go tell Darrell Bach, the evangelical New Testament scholar, that it's worthless. That is a source for James seeing the risen Jesus. And Peter, okay, we don't have a source where Peter says it, but remember the Jesus seminar. They color it pink. That means positive proof positive for Paul, probable for Peter, and I've already given two sources for James. They're the big three. They're the most influential. And by the way, let me just add, Paul went and interviewed them immediately after the crucifixion within 5 to 6 years. And Garrett Ludeman, atheist New Testament scholar. Bart Ehrman, atheist New Testament scholar. Many other, I could give a list. I could give a long list any second if you want it. But they all say this proclamation started immediately after the events in question. Immediately, not 40, 50, 60, 80 years, which critics always like to say. On this subject, these guys just are not given the best data. And what bothers me the most is it seems to me when a caller doesn't know the whole case, you don't expect the callers to know the whole case. It's not their job. They want to lead them to believe there's nothing, no story here, no story there. And you're going to hear that in just a second here. And I think Mike's going to want to address what Paul Ogia says about the Apostle Paul with no statements on his appearance.
All right.
I'm sorry, I'm quite a naive person because I saw the case for Christ and the person said, oh, well, liars don't make martyrs. That's a fact. And I thought, okay, liars don't make martyrs then. But then if you're...
Wait. You watched a movie, The Case for Christ, and you heard someone say liars don't make martyrs, and then you just believed that liars don't make martyrs? Is that all it takes? If that's the case, then you should believe me and Paul when we say that, in fact, someone might be a liar and martyred.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's difficult for me, obviously, because I've got a learning disability, so it's quite hard for me to think about these things. So apologies for that.
No, it's fine. We're just going to point out the problems that we see in reasoning, and you're done fine in expressing it. The thing is, let's say, for example, that we'll double it. 4 of the apostles knowingly allowed themselves to be murdered while stating, I have witnessed the risen Christ who was dead and now lives, and I will say this until you run me through that it is true. Let's say there were 4 of them that did it.
Yeah.
That meets all of Paul's criteria. It's express statements, and let's say we had good, solid evidence for that. Does that mean that those 4 people are actually telling the truth? And does that mean that there actually is a Jesus that rose from the dead?
Well, actually, probably, I'm sorry to say this, and I'm going to put my hands up here, probably not, because in World War II, a lot of Germans died claiming that Hitler was going to win the war and things like that. So, yeah, probably not. I mean, the thing is that because it happened 2,000 years ago, Yeah, no, you're probably right. It's that it's not probably the four. Well, that's put it back to two. I mean, two died for winning a lie. I mean, two died for claiming it was a lie. I mean, that is a possibility, I suppose. But it's just for me. I just thought that when I was told that, I thought it was quite a good argument.
Well,
but obviously,
Hey, Marlon.
you
And
know,
you have
Marlon, I think here's the deal. You know, you can come up with all kinds of different hypotheses to try to account for what happened, but this is where the task of the historian comes in. You weigh those hypotheses by how well they explain the data. And when you do that, the resurrection hypothesis comes out better than any other competing hypotheses. So that's why you go with resurrection, because it explains the data better than these other. So yeah, that's what I'd say there.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead and get what Paul Ogier says next here about Paul.
All right.
the question: how might they? You know, we're talking about the two. We're talking about if we're talking about Peter and Paul, who are the best attested. Paul saw a vision. Everything that he says, if you look in Galatians, when he describes what happened to him, he was caught up in the third heaven. He didn't know whether it was real or not. He describes that himself. So Paul had a vision, and that leaves sort of down to one. So now we're down to Peter. So how can we explain Peter? Perhaps it's a post-bereavement hallucination, which are well documented. It happens about 15% of the population. And it can even be multimodal. And so, you know, it's not so hard. I understand that if you think that 500 people saw him, well, that's different. But all we have is a story that 500 people saw him.
All
if
right,
we're really
stop there.
Yeah. I knew he was gonna jump on this one, man.
It's getting really deep. It's getting really deep, Marlon. Go ahead, Mike.
First of all, he talks about the appearance to Paul being mentioned in Galatians, being caught up in the third heaven. That's 2 Corinthians. I believe it's chapter 4 at the very beginning. And that it's not likely at all. In fact, it's extremely improbable that Paul is referring to the appearance of Jesus that led to his conversion. And here's why. Most New Testament scholars agree that they take Paul's letters and then they take the book of Acts and they form a chronology from that. And most New Testament scholars who focus on this kind of an issue would say that Paul's conversion experience happened sometime between the early to mid 30s, okay, AD 30s, that is. And so now let's take 2 Corinthians. Most scholars will date 2 Corinthians between the years 55 and 58. Now let's state it in such a way that's going to be friendliest to what Paul Lagia is saying here. Okay, so we'll go with 55 here. 2 Corinthians 55. Now, if you look at verse 2 of chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians, that's where Paul is mentioning being caught up into the third heaven. He says that 14 years ago, he was caught up in the third heaven. Now, if you take from 55 and subtract 14, you come up with the year 41. But Paul's conversion experience would have happened probably no later than the year 35. So it just doesn't work out that this would be the conversion experience that Paul is talking about. Paul Lagia is just
down to just two people.
He's not really looked at things here.
Who became.
Yeah. So, Dr. Gary, do you have anything to add on to that? What about the hallucinations? You know, they make this accusation about the hallucinations, and they say, well, you might have had 500 people, but only a book would have said that. You know, it just seems like they're going out there with a discount every little token, man. It's not giving any step, you know.
That's true. Now, he wasn't, in all fairness, he wasn't saying hallucinations about the resurrection. He was saying these may be post-death hallucinations that 15% of the people see. Okay, he's right about one thing. These are pretty well received events and described by medical persons. But right away, the case is prejudice. He says, well, when people see their loved ones after they bury the body that day, which is really common, and it's only a few seconds long, they're hallucinations. That's a really nice self-serving assumption. when some of these cases, after people are buried, we have wakes in homes, right? That's tradition. We have wakes. We serve food. People come to the house. They're driven from long distances. Some of these post-death visions are seen by multiple people at one time. No, but Paul Logia either doesn't know the data or he just wants to whisk it away by going, these are hallucinations, not giving it a chance of being the real thing. Oh, and he's probably going to say, oh, do you want to think the real things? I'll tell you what. If I gave you some of the evidence for post-death visions, they're only less than seconds long, but these are written up in medical journals. If you want to see some of the data, you'd at least try to respond to it instead of whisking it away with the word hallucinations. It was just another shot that doesn't deal with the data. And again, back to Paul, where he said, we don't even know. Mike already referred to, he says, Paul said he saw Jesus in Galatians. Okay, and then he gives us reference from 2 Corinthians 12. And then he says, that's it. Total ignorance of 1 Corinthians 15:8 that the Jesus Seminar risks as a read, which means for sure, and totally ignoring 1 Corinthians 9:1, a normal word for sight. Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord? Look, we're either going to take data at face value, or we're going to ignore it and give the story we want. I see the second option over and over and over. And frankly, it bothers me because it takes advantage of people who don't know the data.
Yeah. And that's precisely, obviously, this is precisely what they're doing right now. They're totally taking advantage of this guy. This guy's clearly not aware of all the data that's out there. So let's see what else they have to say.
Believers, at least 5 years apart, they had separate experiences that they believed themselves were genuine. Then we're just talking about, and I think Matt would agree, that we don't deny experiences. People's experiences are their experiences. The problem comes when they attribute them to certain things, and we don't know if they're attributing them to the right thing or not. So the fact that we have two men in history who died attributing an experience to something, and frankly, we don't even know whether Paul just died politically or not. The evidence is pretty slim here. Like, this is one of the weaker resurrection apologetics, I would say.
It's one of the, I don't know.
Well, that's the. So both of you guys are shaking your head. Go ahead, Dr. Gary.
It's Mike's turn, but if I could see something real quickly. I like the way we got from some evidence to no evidence, and it goes like this. We've got no evidence for Paul seeing anything. I'm going to ignore the two clear cases. I'm going to talk about one unclear case and get the book wrong, and then I'm going to say, voila, no story here. They're going to go to Peter. Well, it's not 1 Peter or 2 Peter. How about the creed of 1 Corinthians 15:3, which is affirmed by Bart Ehrman? Almost every living critic, atheist New Testament scholars, Jewish New Testament scholars, they accept that first statement as being, Peter could be wrong, but it's a great case, they would say. And these guys go, yeah, nothing here, nothing here, nothing here. We've got nothing. Then here's the conclusion. What a flimsy case. Well, your case is flimsy. Why don't you play with the real data and deal with the data instead of just giving your little opinions, which are totally ungrounded and wrong. He gets the book wrong. He gets the chapter wrong. He ignores the two passages on Paul. I'll tell you what, when I heard this for the first time, Marlon, I thought, I've had it. I mean, at least be fair with the data. You don't have to believe it, but be fair with it.
Yeah. Any add-ons to that, Dr. Mike Licona?
Not really. I mean, he does make a lot of simple, naive errors. And of course, you can expect some of these things from anyone. Now, I mean, I'm going to make them in the course of a live discussion. You're going to mix up some books or chapters or something like that, but he seems to be doing it constantly. So it's more than just a little hiccup here and there. It's a lot. It's happening a lot. And the death of Paul, I mean, Paul himself in his letters talk about how he was persecuted, even in what is it, where he talks about, I think it's 2 Corinthians. I think it's 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where he says, we as apostles die daily. Or maybe that's 1 Corinthians 15. We die daily. In other words, they're under the threat of death daily. they could be killed. And they went through all this sort of persecution. So the fact that they're willing to continue this, and Paul had a pretty good lifestyle by his own testimony. He's a Pharisee. He's growing up, and he was going up the chain of leadership within Judaism at that point, and he gives all that up to live a life of being persecuted harshly for his gospel proclamation. So, and then you've got later testimonies that he was martyred just outside of Rome by being beheaded. But even if you throw out those, you still have Paul's own testimony, corroborated by the book of Acts, that Paul endured great persecution for his gospel proclamation.
Mm-hmm. Interesting stuff, guys. Interesting stuff. All right, so this portion is Gina Belk. Gina Belk has actually been on this show before, and let's see what Gina Belk and Matt Dillahunty has to say.
I think, are we going to take this last call real quick?
I'm okay with it if you are.
Yeah, so I've got Aaron in Phoenix, Arizona, who asks, why do I not believe in Jesus? What would I accept as evidence of the resurrection? I kind of touched on this. Are you there, Aaron?
I'm here.
I kind of touched on that a minute ago. That's kind of why I went to the resurrection. I don't know what would count as good evidence for a resurrection. I would think that if we're speaking resurrection, I would need good evidence that the person was dead, verifiable, testable evidence the person was dead, and then verifiable, testable evidence that they were alive after that point at which they were dead, with some significant time gap, because we can resuscitate people in the short term and in specific circumstances. It's not that I'm opposed to thinking that somebody came back from the dead. It is the specifics of the story aren't supported by available evidence. It was evidently a single instance occurrence. And even if I were to believe that it happened, I still wouldn't have any way to know how or why it happened. How do you rule out other unknowns?
You guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just say, he's looking for verifiable evidence. And I would, he talks about what would be verifiable to him, but I think it's important to observe that Matt's not even sure that Jesus existed. So, that is a fringe position that is taken. You could count the number of bona fide scholars in the relevant field of history, New Testament studies who focus on historical investigation. You can count the number of bona fide scholars in the relevant fields who hold the position that Jesus probably did not exist. You could count them on both of your hands. All the scholars in the entire world who hold that position. That is how fringe a position that is. That's the position that Matt takes. He's not sure that Jesus existed. Why? Because he's not convinced by the evidence. So if he's not even convinced by the evidence that Jesus existed, then of course he's not going to be convinced by the evidence that Jesus died or that he rose from the dead. I think his burden of proof is just unreasonable.
Dr. Gary, anything?
Yeah, Marlon, as I sit here, I'm reminding myself, I'll try to be calm on this answer, okay? I'll try to calm down a little bit.
All right.
Bart Ehrman, in his book, which I've used as a graduate apologetics text several times, Did Jesus Exist? To piggyback on Mike's point, I don't know Matt. Mike knows him. But Mike says he takes the view that Jesus probably, or there's a good chance he didn't exist. Bart Ehrman addresses that, and he says, of those who think Jesus doesn't exist, now that may or may not be Matt, but Mike seems to think that's pretty close to Matt's position. And Bart says, something like this, of the thousands of people who teach relevant subjects in accredited colleges, seminaries, and universities around the world, he said, I know of nobody, no accredited scholar teaching an accredited school who teaches that position. Now, they might say, well, that's an argument from authority. Well, hey, that's not a fallacy. I don't go to a paper boy to have my tooth pulled. I go to a dental surgeon. There's authorities relevant. So when I want to ask a question about Jesus, I go to the authorities. And when nobody holds that view, yes, there's a slight chance they could be mistaken. There's a great chance Matt and his colleagues are mistaken. And if that's the data for evidence, wake up and smell the roses. Start looking at history, look at the data, and if even Bart Ehrman, the atheist New Testament scholar, says anybody who takes that view is, you're not in an accredited school, I don't know where you are, how come nobody accepts your view? That doesn't prove it's wrong, but it's highly likely with dedicated specialists who don't believe, atheists, agnostic, skeptics, Jewish New Testament scholars, highly likely that the view of Jesus and that something really happened to all those guys and they died for what they believe was an appearance is true.
All right. Let's see what else they have to say.
Okay. So, of course, we can't bring back that event, and not knowing or not observing that situation. There's no way to test that to see if it was true.
Well, not
I
only
agree
that,
with that.
but the only evidence for the resurrection of Jesus are in the Gospels.
Gary, I know you're on it, man. What you got, Gary?
Well, first of all, that's not true. It's just not true. Flat out not true. I've already cited the Gospel of the Hebrews from about 125 AD. You go, well, hey, that's you fundamentalists. When you get something outside the Bible, you like it, you go for it. And again, I said, tell Dom Crossan you think he's stupid. A famous New Testament skeptic. Tell that to Bart. I don't know what he'd say about that. Tell that to Darrell Bach, an evangelical New Testament scholar, when he writes about this book. But there's others. Clement of Rome, about 95 AD. Ignatius, about 107 AD. Polycarp, 110 AD. Ignatius, for example, says, 7 years after the close of the New Testament canon, Ignatius says, when Jesus said, touch me, Ignatius said, they reached out and held on to him. You can say, I don't accept that. That's fine. But don't say there are no sources from that early time that affirm this. That's because you've whisked them under the carpet. Then you go, no story here. And I just object to that kind of scholarship or lack thereof.
Yeah, I hear you. Dr. Mike, what you got, man?
No, I'll just go with what Gary said there.
All right.
Nothing to add.
Yeah, what?
All right.
So there's no evidence that you would accept to
I'm willing to accept
that was true.
I'm willing to accept that the gospel authors are accurately writing what they heard or believed to be true. In the same way that if my mom comes and tells me that she was abducted by aliens, I don't think my mom is lying to me. I'm willing to accept that she had an experience that she is trying to describe in that fashion, but that doesn't tell me what actually happened. And so when we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are anonymous gospels, not written by those names, ages ago when we can't investigate, and you have an oral tradition.
Dr. Mike, I saw that face, man. I saw the face. What you got, Dr. Mike?
Yeah. Well, let me just say this about Matt. I did debate him a few years ago, and I think it's a popular debate that's viewed online. On my channel, I think it's been viewed 600,000 times already. So my experience debating him was a pleasant one. We got along well, treated one another respectfully on stage, and yeah, I've got no problems with him. I do have problems with his arguments. To say that the Gospels are anonymous is a card that is it's overplayed big time. When it is true, I believe it's true that the Gospels in the autographs, in the original form, were probably anonymous. They probably did not contain the titles, the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark. I think those were probably added later, maybe in the 2nd century. But it's overplayed, and here's why. When you take all the biographies that were written in that period, and over 100 of them, okay, in that period, if you just look at 150 years on each side of Jesus, this 300-year period, about any biography written about anyone, you have about 90, okay? But if you extend it even way past that, you've got over 100, okay? All of them are anonymous, with only two exceptions. You have the passing of Peregrinus by Lucian of Samosata in the middle of the 2nd century, and then you have the life of Aelius in the Historia Augusta, written at the end of the 4th century. That's about a half a century after the Council of Nicaea. That's how late that is. Those are the only two that contain the author's name in it. The rest of them are anonymous. Biographies aren't the only thing. You can take the writings of Livy, one of the great Roman historians. It's anonymous. You can take the writings of Sallust, whom the famous Roman rhetorician Quintilian said was a better historian than Livy, and that you had to be advanced in your studies to appreciate him properly. All of Sallust's writings are anonymous. Plutarch, I should say Caesar's commentary on the Civil War. They're not only anonymous, Caesar wrote them, but it's anonymous, and it's written entirely in the 3rd person, much like the Gospel of John is. Plutarch is regarded as the greatest ancient biographer by classicists today. He wrote over 60 biographies, of which 48 have survived. None of them have Plutarch's name in the preface, in the proem, or the title, the preface, the proem, or anywhere throughout them. They're anonymous in the same sense the Gospels are. So if you're going to play this card and say, we don't even know who wrote the Gospels because they're anonymous, you've got to say that with a lot of the major Greco-Roman writings, which classicists are convinced that they know the authors of these. They don't even question it for a lot of them. The ones I mentioned, they don't question. And I would say that the evidence we have for the traditional authorship of the Gospels, it's not unimpeachable by any means, but our evidence we have for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being the traditional authors is superior to the evidence we have that Plutarch wrote those lives, the biographies attributed to him. And yet you'd be hard-pressed to find a classicist today who questions whether Plutarch wrote those. So the bottom line, I think, there was still reason to think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them, even though they're anonymous in terms of the titles. Just as we have external evidence that would suggest that Plutarch wrote the lives, that Sallust wrote the war with Jugurtha, the war with Catiline, and his histories of Rome, and Livy's Roman histories as well, and all of those.
Dr. Gary, you got anything?
Yeah, Mike, I don't want to put you on the spot. Do you want to address the case for the what critics usually think is the best of all the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark? I mean, is this totally anonymous and nobody has a clue as to who wrote it?
Well, I have at HBU, I've got some really sharp grad students there. And one was a guy named Joshua Pelletier. And so I supervised his MA thesis, and he did it on where critical scholars stand on some prolegomena related to Mark. Who wrote Mark? When was it written? And the third one, does it go back to Petrine tradition? Does it go back to the Apostle Peter, that he was the eyewitness that passed along the information to Mark? And so he surveyed more than 200 critical New Testament scholars writing since 1965 in English, okay? So he didn't look at German scholars because he doesn't read German. He didn't look at French or any other. But over 200 critical scholars writing in English since 1965 up to the present. And he found that the majority of them who comment on this think that Mark is the author of Gospel of Mark, and that his primary source was the Apostle Peter. And they also think that Mark wrote somewhere between the years 50 and 70. And you can narrow that further to between 65 and 70, the years 65 and 70. But the majority of those critical scholars who are discussing it in writing, in academic writings, are saying that Mark is the traditional authorship of the Gospel of Mark is correct. And he lists all the reasons, the pros and cons reasons, and the rebuttals and the answers to those, all the reasons in that. And that'll probably be published in a few years. He's going to go on and do his doctoral dissertation and expand that list even further.
That's nice. Cool. So we have about a minute and 30 seconds left in this video. So audience, Dr. Gary Habermas and Dr. Mike Licona will be taking some questions. So get those questions in and let's finish up this video. Let's see what else they have to say.
That is ultimately written down where the facts of and the details don't line up. What can we say from those books happened at all if we don't have independent confirmation of this thing?
Yeah, let's just stop it there, and I'll comment real quickly. You know, again, this is something that's overplayed, a card that's overplayed as well, and that's that gospel differences, discrepancies, contradictions, whatever you want to say. When I did my 8-year study on this that resulted in the book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? I found that when you look at the, even Plutarch himself, when he's reporting the same story 2 or more times, the kind of differences that you see between the accounts where the details aren't lining up perfectly are the same kind of things that we see in the Gospels. Now, you're talking with Plutarch, the same author using the same sources, writing about the same events, and many times he's writing them writing these different biographies simultaneously, and they just don't line up. But they're peripheral details, and many times you can account for them because of the use of compositional devices that were prescribed in the compositional textbooks and were part and parcel of writing historiography of that day.
Dr. Gary?
Well, I'll just say real briefly, Marlon. I think all those claimed contradictions, discrepancies in the Gospels, you can give great answer to them. But let's just say, for the sake of the argument, all the contradictions are true. If you make a case for the resurrection that uses only a half dozen facts, which the most critical scholars in the world, New Testament scholars, accept, we're talking Gerrit Ludemann, Bart Ehrman, Jewish non-Christian New Testament scholars like Pinchas Lapid, Geza Vermesch of Oxford, Pinchas Lapid of Tübingen University in Germany. These scholars, if you use only a half dozen facts, there's enough to show there's a resurrection. Enough from the critics' facts. Mike and I often like to answer questions when we go to universities, and they'll say, but there's so many problems in the Gospels. And we'll say, well, we don't agree with you, but hey, you must be missing my point. Because I'm not talking about the passages that we both disagree on. I'm talking about the passages we agree on. And if we get resurrection from those facts, and you're a naturalist, your view's in a heap of trouble because it looks like Jesus was raised. So I think we can take the facts which the most skeptical New Testament scholars allow, that Jesus was raised from the dead.
Good stuff, guys. Good stuff.
Okay, let's go back real quick to the resurrection. Okay, so is there a possibility that it could have happened?
I don't know. I have no reason to think it's possible. How could you demonstrate that it's possible?
Yeah, because we both can't go back in time and observe that situation. So there's a possibility.
No, there's not a possibility until a possibility is demonstrated.
Why is that?
The fact that you can't show it's impossible does not mean it's possible. Just like the fact that you can't show that it's possible doesn't mean it's impossible. Both possibility and impossibility would need to be demonstrated.
That makes.
I'm just watching you guys. I see your facial expressions. I'm like, all right, I know when to stop. So I'm going to stop here. What do you guys think what Matt Dillahunty just said?
Go ahead, Gary.
I'm going to say now we've compounded historical and gospel errors with logical errors. Now this is really getting deep. And you have to prove something's possible? Really? Well, I admit this is a little bit of a, I admit I'm being a little bit humorous here, okay? Here's evidence number 1. We'll sweep that in the corner. Evidence number 2, when you're not looking, I'm going to kick that aside. Evidence 3, nobody's seen anything here. Evidence 4, Paul never claims anything. I'll totally ignore the passages where he does. There's nothing here. These guys didn't die. Well, we got secular sources for that. And here's the conclusion. Probable? It's not even possible. Well, sure. If you ignore everything, I am not surprised. This is just... I'm going to get worked up. No, this is taking gospel data, history, and logic all and brushing it in the corner, little sleight of hand, and hope you didn't see the move. And then say, here's my conclusion. Nothing. You have any questions? Nothing. Boy, did I do a good job. That's what I'm seeing.
Interesting stuff. You got anything else, Mike? Dr. Mike?
Yeah, you know, throughout this discussion between these three on here, you know, they talk about, well, maybe it was this. Well, maybe this happened instead. Maybe it was a hallucination and all this. Did they provide any evidence for it? No. So how do we know it's possible? You know, it seems like the way that they conduct their investigation or think through things only applies to the other guy. It doesn't apply to them. Now, maybe they'd say, well, it's possible because we know that people do hallucinate. Well, I would just turn around and say, well, the supernatural is possible because people do see things like this. Miracles do occur. There are a lot of documented miracles. You got Craig Keener, who has documented a bunch of things. He's got eyewitnesses of these. Craig has shared some things to which he's been an eyewitness. I've experienced some things that I believe are supernatural events. I would interpret them as demonic. I have friends who have told me about experiences. At least you'd have to say they're paranormal. I understand that saying they're demonic puts my own Christian interpretation on them, but let's take that away. We can still call them paranormal. There's plenty of evidence for this. I think the evidence we have for a supernatural dimension of reality is so strong that when you look at it objectively, anyone who denies it can't consider themselves to be a realist.
Yeah, let me add there, Marlon, just a sentence.
Yep.
Mike refers to the 2-volume work by Craig Keener, Miracles, where Craig, bless his heart, he doesn't do apologetics, but he's probably got over 1,000 cases there. A number of them have pre and post MRIs, pre and post CAT scans, pre and post X-rays for the same person. Tumors disappear, bones are healed immediately without scars on the bones and no swelling of the attendant tissue. Doctors say that's a bunch of baloney, that doesn't happen until they get the X-rays. And I have a book right over my shoulder here by a Harvard PhD on miracles today, documented cases of miracles. More apologetic baloney until you find out that the book is published by Harvard University Press, and the back of the book, the 2 endorsements are from a present and a past professor from Harvard Medical School. Yep, no story here. More stupidity from believers. Nothing to see here while you're kicking it under the table once again. It's just playing fast and loose with the data help nobody.
Good stuff. So let's finish it up here, about 49 seconds. Let's see what else they have to say.
That makes no sense, but you can't say that it's impossible. You can't prove that it happened or didn't happen.
How can you say something is possible? How can you say something is possible just because nobody's been able to show it's impossible?
And how could you say that it's impossible? Nobody showed that it was possible.
Exactly. And if you were listening to me, I literally said just that. Both possibility and impossibility would need to be demonstrated. So you don't get to claim it's possible, and I don't get to claim it's impossible. What I said when you asked me, what I said when you asked me if it was possible was I have no reason to believe that it's possible. There's been no demonstration of that.
Exactly.
He's not saying that he is convinced that it is impossible. Those are two different things. Do you understand that?
I'm saying that.
Do you understand that, Aaron? Before we move on.
Exactly.
All right, that is the end of that. You guys have any final thoughts? You're going to say goodbye to Gina Belka, Matt Dillahunty. So, with some final thoughts there. What you got?
I think it's hilarious that you can have pre and post CAT scans, pre and post MRIs, pre and post X-rays, but you ready? It's not even possible. Why? Because I said so. I find that a very unimpressive argument. In fact, it's not an argument.
Mike Licona?
I'm good.
You good? You good? All right, cool. Good stuff. Thank you guys for just interacting with that video. So now we're going to transition to some a little bit of Q&A. I ain't going to let you guys hang on here too long. get some of these questions in because they are jumping around with these questions. I have some super chats here, and let's get this one in. All right. Thank you for the super chat, Jim. I appreciate you. I've got to cut out early, but if a super chat can allow me to ask a question, were any of the essays in Raised on the Third Day surprising or particularly interesting to Dr. Habermas? Fantastic book.
Well, actually, I should pass this one to Dr. Lacona because I just have a little tiny thank you chapter in there. I didn't even know it was being written until after it came out. I mean, he and Dr. Dave Beck, good, fantastic guys. They were good enough to do this Festschrift, but I didn't write it and I didn't line the guys up. Mike Lacona did, and they did a knockout job of getting the best people, including a fairly well-known a very well-known New Testament, I think skeptic is fair, and a non-Christian Jewish scholar to write an article. So we're not just citing people who agree with us and sweeping things under the carpet, but Mike did the work on this.
All right, Mike, any thoughts on that question?
All of the essays in that book are just really, really good. Dave Beck and I were just so honored to have so many people, so good people, good scholars who wrote and contributed essays. And it was a pleasure to do it for Gary because he's had such an influence and impact in my life. I don't know that I'd be a Christian today if not for Gary. He was so unselfish in the time that he spent with me when I was having questions and doubts about my faith. So it was an honor. It was a pleasure to do this book for him. But yeah, there were so many of them. The ones that Gary's mentioning, those essays, Dale Allison, I don't know that I'd call him a skeptic. He's not an evangelical. He's a distinguished New Testament professor at Princeton. I think he's one of the finest New Testament scholars in the world. I don't agree with him on a number of things, but he's a fantastic. No one can question the quality of his scholarship and his honesty and authenticity, his transparency. I mean, he's been extremely influential in my life just reading his stuff. And then Barry Schwartz, the Jewish non-believer, who was the official photographer on the STURP Shroud of Turin research project team. He thinks he gives some reasons. He is not a believer. He's not a Christian. Okay, he's Jewish, not a Christian. He might even be an agnostic, as far as I know. But Barry says that he believes the Shroud of Turin may very well be the authentic Shroud of Jesus, and his article, his essay in the book, completely discredits the carbon-14 dating that supposedly showed that the shroud was a forgery.
All right, cool. All right, so I have a couple statements here, another super chat, so I guess you guys sort of interact with it. It's from Sentinel Apologetics. Thank you, Robert. Appreciate you, man. It's interesting that Paul's conversion wasn't due to personal sin, but rather he initially thought Jesus was a crucified man cursed by God, and then understood that Jesus was cursed by God for us. You guys have any thoughts on that?
I agree.
No, except I would add that there's something in between Paul's prior view and his last view, and that is that he was overwhelmed by an appearance of Jesus Christ and his life changed forever. And if we're going to keep saying, oh, there's no sources here, and ignore what he has to say, ignore what virtually, I don't know, Mike's the guy to answer this, but I don't think any accredited New Testament scholars, believers or unbelievers, will say 1 Corinthians and 1 Corinthians 15:8 are not great verses. So if you let Paul speak for himself, he tells you why he changed his view of Jesus being the man who was accredited by God and recognized for who he claimed to be.
Stuff. And here's another comment by Sentinel Apologetics. Thank you for the super chat again, Robert. Appreciate you. Paul had zeal for Torah and sought to destroy this new heretical movement because the crucifixion was proof that Jesus was a false prophet. But he had a radical change and believed Jesus was alive. Any thoughts on that?
I agree again.
You agree? we all agree. We all agree. Thank you, Robert, for the super chats. Appreciate you, brother. All right, we got a question coming here, and this is from Acts 2 Pentecostal. I have a question Bart Ehrman claims that we can't trust the Gospels are historically accurate since they contain contradictions. And one of the examples he gave was that Jairus?
Jairus.
Jairus.
Yeah, that Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. I think that is, I know it's in Matthew. I think it's in Mark as well. It might even be in Luke. I deal with this in my book. Why are there differences in the Gospels? So with Mark, Jairus comes to Jesus and says, "My daughter is about to die. Please come heal her." And so they go, and on the way, some people from Jairus' home come out and they say, "Don't trouble the teacher anymore. Your daughter has just died." And Jesus says, "Don't worry, just have faith." And then he goes to Jairus' house and he raises his daughter from the dead. In Matthew's gospel, you've got Jairus who comes to Jesus and says, "My daughter has just died. Please come heal her." So the difference, she was already dead when Jairus came to Jesus in Matthew. And then there's no people who come from Jairus' house to say, "Don't trouble him anymore. Your daughter's just died." Why? Because she's already dead. Matthew does something here, which he does elsewhere in his gospel a few times, where he just simplifies the account and just has her already dead. He just simplifies it. So I don't look at this as a contradiction. Simplification was a common compositional device. We do it all the time in our everyday conversations as well. We don't consider that to be an error. But Bart, and I like Bart, we're friends. I think he nitpicks in this kind of stuff. And when I point out to him that these are just simple compositional devices that are responsible for many of these differences in the Gospels, he acknowledges that. He just says that they're historically unreliable because they're not saying things exactly as they occurred. And then I'd say, well, Bart, but that's the same way it is with virtually all ancient literature, because all ancient historians and biographers use these kinds of compositional devices. It was prescribed in the compositional textbooks. You can see a number of them there. And then you can infer others by how people like Plutarch, reports the same event, but does so differently. And Bart says, yeah, they're all unreliable. He says, Mike, and you can go to my YouTube channel and you can see this interaction between Bart and I. We had a panel discussion in Chicago a year and a half ago where we talked about these things. And he says, look, they're all historically unreliable. And I say, I don't think that makes them unreliable. And he says, well, the average person today isn't going to think of reliability in the sense that you are. And I said, well, I agree with that. They're probably not, but they're not thinking about things deeply in historical terms as you and I would think about. I said, Bart, the thing is, if we're going to go with reliability, as you're saying, then we'd have to say that all ancient literature is historically unreliable, and that gives a false impression to the average person who doesn't look into these kinds of things. So I think it's best that we qualify and talk about these things and update and educate people on how to think about reliability.
Good point. Good point.
Marlon, if I could add real quickly, when Mike's being very specific here in his book on alleged differences in the Gospels is an excellent comparison of ancient history to the Gospel sources. That's why it's been published by Oxford, and that's why it's made such a splash. But a big picture about Bart Ehrman is this: Bart Ehrman does not tell you that these little things in the Gospels keep you from knowing about the historical Jesus or many key events from Jesus. In fact, to give you just one example, if the gospel of Christ in the early church, if it's the teaching, if it primarily considers, zeroes in on the crucifixion, resurrection of Jesus Christ, the person of Christ, Bart Ehrman admits the big picture. For example, was Jesus crucified? Bart Ehrman gives 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus, and about a half dozen of them are within his time range and outside the New Testament. So when critics continually say, don't use the New Testament as prejudiced, Bart Ehrman answers that, and he says, I resent that. I don't quote New Testament verses because they're quote in the Bible. I don't believe in inspiration. He says, I quote the ones that are in the Gospels because they're reliable, those actual texts. But then of his 15 sources for the crucifixion of Jesus, a number of them are post-canonical and non-Christian, and I repeat, within Bart's 100-year from the crucifixion to 130 AD. 15 sources, independent, different for the crucifixion. So he can pick out these little things, but it does not keep him from saying there's history here.
Good points. Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. We have another question here. All right. It's coming from Eric B. How's it going, Eric? How can average people like me access ancient documents that are critical to the resurrection story? Where are the best sources, virtual or otherwise? Thanks.
Well, the best sources for the resurrection are going to be in the New Testament. And even Bart Ehrman, he says, when we want to know about Jesus, he says this in his New Testament introduction. He says, the best place to get information about Jesus, the most reliable information, is in the Gospels. And he says that this is not for theological reasons. It is for historical reasons, pure and simple. I'm virtually quoting him there. So the best sources we're going to have are going to be in the New Testament.
And when
you
critics
can get
say
those sources either online or at a local bookstore, you can buy your New Testament.
But when people say, no, you Christians are citing Christian sources, we want objective stuff. Number one, once again, Bart cites things outside the New Testament, and they are non-Christian. But secondly, Bart says over and over again, I only cite the reliable material from the Gospels, and it's the best source. And he thinks Paul is the number one source. Paul is the number one source. We go back to the discussion tonight that you showed, and they just go, yeah, Paul, who's Paul? He just probably had a vision. He didn't say anything, and they don't even get the verses right. So I think Bart would just giggle if he saw some of that stuff. I can't speak for him, but he thinks there's enough there to make a case for the historical Jesus. That's why the book's called "Did Jesus Exist?" and he says a resounding yes.
If we're going to rule out the New Testament literature because it's written by Christians and therefore biased, well, are we really going to say then that a Jewish historian couldn't write on the Holocaust? Are we going to say an African American historian couldn't write on slavery in the United States because they're biased? Of course we wouldn't. An African American historian would be perhaps the best person to write on slavery in the U.S. A Jewish historian perhaps may be the best person to write on the Holocaust. And likewise, those who were committed followers of Jesus and who had access to the eyewitnesses would have been the very best people to write on this.
Yeah.
By the way, Bart Ehrman says exactly the same thing. He says, if the New Testament writers should not be considered because of prejudice, I think his example is the Revolutionary War. If I interview writers from the American Revolutionary War, should I ignore them because they're Americans? And should I ignore them because they won? That's his example. He goes, baloney. These are the best sources available. And he even says in that book, he says the New Testament's not reliable, the Gospels are not reliable, but he does stake out many, many facts for Jesus' life. And so anybody who kind of tries to put that on people like Garrett Ludeman or Pinchas Lapid or Geza Vermesh or Bart Ehrman are not reading those guys. In fact, the Jewish New Testament scholar, when he was alive, Pinchas Lapid, PhD New Testament from a German university, he believed Jesus was raised from the dead. He said Jesus was raised from the dead. Oh, and by the way, you know what he says? 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following can be taken as the words of eyewitnesses. And tonight we heard Paul Ogia say it's only a mere story. He's not lining up with people who don't even believe it.
Yeah, I just think it's this dangerous area of confirmation bias. You know what I mean? When you're dealing with these guys who only, associate the things that agree with their positions, and they say, oh, that's true. But but he, like you were saying earlier, Dr. Gary, they just sort of kick the other stuff under the rug, or and when you're not looking, they kick the other stuff in the corner. It's just such a dangerous way to approach everything, you know. And it's just important that we steer clear of performing that kind of act of confirmation bias. Let me see. We have another question here. A couple more questions, guys, and I'm gonna let you go. No, it's getting late. All right, this is from Keenan. Thank you, Keenan, for the question. What does Mike and Gary think of Dale Martin's view that Jesus' resurrection in Paul was the stuff?
I'm not sure what he means by that. Now, I've debated Dale Martin twice, and we've had collegial debates. You can watch those on my YouTube channel as well. We debated on the resurrection. I disagree with Dale's view of resurrection and what they thought back then. You know, when I was doing my doctoral research, I looked up things like spiritual body, this is reflected in my large book on the resurrection, spiritual body and what Paul believes in resurrection. Looked up the term psychikos for natural, pneumatikos for spiritual. I think there was like 846 occurrences of psychikos that occurs between the 8th century BC and the 3rd century. And there were, I think, 1,131 occurrences of pneumatikos, typically translated spiritual. And I say these two terms because they're the ones in the disputed passage, or the one that's debated on its meaning in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul's talking about what resurrection is like, what happens to the body. And he says, it is sown a natural body, is raised a spiritual body. Well, what does spiritual body mean in this context? And how is it used in antiquity? Well, spirit can be used in a sense of ethereal, you know, kind of invisible, ghost-like, things like that. But psychikos is never used in a sense of physical. It's used in different senses, but I think, but never in a sense of physical. So the contrast that many people try to make here, that it's sown a physical body, it's raised a spiritual body, meaning applied to Jesus, his body is buried a physical body, but it's only raised in spirit. The corpse would have still been in the tomb. That is not at all what they're talking about in 1 Corinthians 15. That's not how Paul viewed resurrection. He viewed it as a resurrection of the corpse. So when Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20, he says, Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. In other words, he's the first to be raised in a resurrection body at the inception of the general resurrection. And then 3 verses later, verse 23, he says how we're going to be raised, when we're going to be raised. He says, but each in its own order, Christ the first fruits, after that those who belong to Christ at his coming. So Jesus was raised in the year 30 or 33, and we're going to be raised when he returns, his followers are. But that doesn't say anything in terms of the essence or the nature of the resurrection. For that, you can go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. And Paul says, I don't want you to grieve as those who have no hope if you've lost a loved one in Christ. He says, because when Christ returns, he will bring with him those who have died as Christians. Okay, so we imagine Christ coming back. He's going to bring with him those who have died as Christians. And then he says, the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised first. Well, wait a minute. If he's bringing the dead in Christ back with him, then what's going to be raised? Yeah. Well, it can be nothing else other than the corpse, which are then reunited with the spirits of the believers who are returning with Christ. So it is a bodily, physical resurrection. And so that's what Paul is imagining. He is thinking that Jesus was raised. His corpse was raised, physical, bodily resurrection. And of course, this would have left an empty grave.
Any thoughts on that, Gary?
No, I think Mike does a great job. That study that he talks about on those words over hundreds of years, that's in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach with InterVarsity Academic. Best book in print on the resurrection. And that somebody would take the pains to look at, as he said, over hundreds of years. And if the word never means that, don't tell us this is the only time that's when the word means that. plus Paul. Another one I would add is Philippians chapter 3, recognized by everybody. All these guys will let you use it. Bart Ehrman, Garrett Ludeman, and Paul says, he says Jesus will raise our vile soma body to be like unto his glorious soma body. He could have said very easily, he will raise our vile soma to be like in his glorious pneuma spirit. He doesn't. He says, raise our vile body to be like unto his glorious body. And that's these are all many texts that indicate that really it's a growing view right now that says that Paul was talking about a resurrection body, not just some ethereal spirit.
All right. And this may be our last question of the night. And this is coming from Sahi. Thanks up, but what's up, buddy? It says, have you heard the Muslims' theory that Jesus swooned, but it was specifically the mirror that had healing power and healed and revived Jesus? All natural event.
I haven't heard that one as a Muslim theory. The one I've heard of the Muslims is that that Jesus almost died, but then God took him up, and people thought, like the Jews thought, that they had killed Jesus. This is in Surah, I think it's 4 verses 156, 57, 158, something right around there, that God took him up, but they did not kill him. The problem I have with that is something I call the Islamic catch-22 argument. So we've got really good evidence that Jesus predicted his imminent death. I mean, I can show that using historical method. So if Jesus did not die as he predicted, well, then that would make him a false prophet, right? Because he predicted he was going to die, he was going to be killed in the imminent future. So the Quran talks about him dying, he's going to be killed just after he returns, the second coming. But he predicted he was going to die in the imminent future. So and he said that scripture had to be fulfilled. So he's speaking of this as a prophecy. So if he didn't die, that would make him a false prophet. But the Quran refers to him as a great prophet. So in that case, the Quran would be wrong. The other option is that Jesus did die as he predicted. But in that case, the Quran is mistaken again, because the Quran says that he didn't. Either way, the Quran is wrong when it comes to Jesus there. So the only way to get out of that is to say, well, Jesus didn't predict his death, his imminent death. But, I can give several historical arguments to say that he did, which, how are you going to answer those? And if you can't, then you should throw out the Quran there.
Any thoughts, Dr. Gary?
No, I also would say historically, I've got a book on my shelf over here written by a well-known Muslim scholar, didn't convert to Christianity. And he says, if you talk to a Christian and the Quran says Jesus didn't die on the cross, he says, they will say to you, your book was written exactly 600 years later, and that's lousy history. This is what the Quran, this is what the Muslim scholar says. That Christians will say that's 600 years later, and that's way too late to be history. He said, and then he says, unbelievably, he says, that is exactly right. That's too long. He says, but when they say that to me, I just start thinking about things in the Gospels that don't always make sense. So he's kind of already admitted the point. And then he goes on to try to go after the Gospels. But you go back to Bart Ehrman again, just because there's problems in the Gospels doesn't disprove everything. If you believe there's problems in the Gospels, if you still have these facts that only skeptics allow, skeptics, non-Christians, allow, and they're specialists, and you can base the resurrection on that alone, there's a lot of other belief systems that are incorrect on the fact of the resurrection of Jesus.
Mm.
There's one other thing I could throw in, and this is something I heard from David Wood, and I'm sure you've heard of him. He's just huge on refuting Islam. And David said, we do have really good evidence that the disciples were going around proclaiming that Jesus had been raised from the dead. We have good evidence to think that they actually believe this. So we can understand how God would deceive the enemies of Jesus, the Jewish leadership of that day, and the Romans. We can understand why God would deceive them into thinking they had killed Jesus, but they hadn't. God took him up to heaven. But why would he deceive his own Jesus's followers, whom the Quran refers to as Muslims? And if he's willing to, and as a result, it blossoms into the largest world religion and the greatest competitor to Islam. It wouldn't seem to be very wise of God to do that. And then you look and you say, well, if God is willing to deceive Jesus' disciples, whom, again, the Quran refers to as Muslims, how do you know he's not deceiving you as Muslims right now? So I think that's a decent argument that's given by David.
Good stuff. Well, we have one more statement, a quick statement. And we have a fan. All he wants is you guys to autograph his books, man. That's all he wants. He wants you to autograph his books. he chimed in early. I had to get him in, man. I want to get his statement on here, man. But I thank you guys for coming on the Gospel Truth. It's a joy to have you, and just the expertise. Just having you guys as someone we can glean from, you know, your work that you've put out. We do appreciate everything you're doing. And like I said earlier in the show, the beginning of the show, please keep doing it. You know, all the way until the Lord calls you home, right? Keep doing, keep driving, doing what you do for the body and doing it for the Lord overall, for his glorification. And I thank you guys for coming on the Gospel Truth. I appreciate you so much. And so I'm going to let you guys go. I know it's getting late. All right. So take care. And God bless.
Thank you, Marlon. It's good to be with you again, brother, Marlon. And honored to share it with Gary as well.
Yes. Ditto with Mike. Good night, Marlon.
Good night. God bless.